Secrets and Spies presents Espresso Martini with Chris Carr and Matt Fulton.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Espresso Martini. Chris, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, Matt. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm hanging in there. I'm a little sleepy here. It's still kind of early for this way, but yeah.
Well, it's kind of late here.
Yeah.
Well, it's not that late, but I'm still a bit sleepy as well today. But there we go. It's just these sort of autumn hours coming in.
I know. All right. Well, once again, we have much to discuss. In Gaza, hostage rescue efforts and Hamas's sophisticated intelligence apparatus are complicating plans for Israel's anticipated ground assault. Meanwhile, ATACMS missiles have finally arrived in Ukraine with explosive results on the battlefield. Michael Weiss and the crew at Bellingcat published another deep dive on Russian sabotage operations in Europe. And Donald Trump plans to withdraw the U.S. from NATO if re-elected next year. Get your antacids and Tylenol handy because today's episode is another fun one. On Extra Shot, our bonus show for Patreon subscribers directly following this show, we're talking about how survivors of traumatic events process their experiences through storytelling, how misinformation runs rampant on Elon Musk's X, formerly known as Twitter, how a surprisingly high number of celebrities once served as spies, and we offer our thoughts on Errol Morris's new John le Carré documentary. As always, to access Extra Shot, you'll first need to be a Patreon subscriber, and you can do so by going to patreon.com/secrets and spies. Depending on the subscription level you choose, you'll receive a set of Secrets and Spies coasters or a coffee cup. By subscribing, you'll be directly supporting this podcast, and for that, we shall be eternally grateful. Thanks in advance for your support, and a huge thank you to existing subscribers. Your generosity helps keep this podcast going. Okay, first up, we're covering a pair of articles detailing the staggering complexity of an operation that Israel may launch to rescue any of the estimated 220 hostages held by Hamas in a warren of tunnels beneath Gaza. The first, by Howard Altman for The Drive, cites interviews with former U.S. and Israeli Special Forces officers, an FBI hostage negotiator, and the commander of U.S. Central Command. The second is an op-ed in the New York Times by Dr. Gershon Baskin, who helped negotiate the 2011 release of an Israeli soldier kidnapped by Hamas. Here are some key points from the articles, and then, Chris, I'll hand it over to you. Hostage rescue operations are complex and require detailed planning, intelligence, speed, and surprise. Gathering actionable intelligence is crucial, but the current situation in Gaza, which is an active war zone, makes it challenging to gather information. The lack of surprise in operations is a significant problem, and surprise is a key factor in combat success. Each building and location, such as tunnels where hostages might be held, presents unique challenges, and Hamas can be creative in thwarting rescue attempts. One of the most protected places in Gaza, and I didn't really know this, I hadn't heard this before.
Oh, the hospital.
Yeah. One of the most protected places in Gaza is the Dar el-Shifa hospital, under which is believed to be a Hamas command and control center where some hostages may be held. The IDF is using various sources of intelligence to plan rescues, including open-source information and SIGINT. Cutting off essential services like fuel, electricity, and water is meant to put pressure on Hamas, which may lead to negotiations for the release of hostages, as we've seen through Qatar. U.S. Special Operations Forces have not participated on the ground in a hostage rescue mission with Israelis before, but are likely currently involved assisting the IDF in an advisory role with intelligence gathering and planning. Overall, while the challenges are significant, there is some confidence that more hostages can be saved. And lastly, in 2011, to secure the release of Gilad Shalit, this should give some context here on what we may be facing in the future. So in 2011, to secure the release of Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier captured by Hamas in a cross-border raid from Gaza, Israel released over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Among them was Ali Khadi, who later became a company commander in Hamas's Nukba commando unit and helped lead the October 7th attack. He's since been killed in an IDF drone strike. Chris, what did you think about these articles?
Yeah, I think they're both very interesting. I'm sort of grown to become a big fan of The Drive, actually. I think it's a very interesting... the war zone on The Drive is pretty good, actually. It gets a bit techie sometimes about aircraft and things, which is probably what drove me to it in the first place. But there's some really good analysis on there, and I think these interviews were very interesting. It's a bit like what we were saying kind of last time we spoke about potential hostage rescues. It's not going to be like the movie Delta Force, because in reality, hostage rescues this type are rare and they don't always work out. And when reading this, my mind wandered again to the hostages of Hezbollah in Lebanon in the 1980s, and then recently hostages held by ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So getting intelligence on precise locations of hostages will always be a significant challenge. And as you just mentioned, Hamas used tunnels, and they may or may not be hiding hostages under that hospital. And, we've just come off a very contentious hospital bombing where Israel was originally blamed for it, and then it turns out it might well have been, and I still think there is some element of confusion and doubt of exactly who's responsible, but it looks like, I think it's 99% sure that it was either an Islamic Jihad missile or a Hamas missile that was actually supposed to be hitting Israel that actually took out the hospital, or at least it did some damage to the hospital. Again, I think in that case, the casualty figures may or may not have been exaggerated by Hamas. As the pictures I've seen, it seems to be there was an impact in the car park, from what I've seen. So it's all a little bit sketchy, but a lot of emotions were running high and people were very quick to blame Israel. So again, Israel, if they were going to target this hospital that Hamas have their base in, I just think it's a big no-no. I don't think the Israelis would do that, and that's exactly why terrorist groups like Hamas do this. They hide in public spaces. Also, you could argue, because Gaza is so small, they have lack of space to build bases, so you could argue that. I get that. But then if we look at other hostage situations, so there was a successful one in 2015 when US and Kurdish forces managed to rescue 70 hostages held by ISIS. And this operation led to the death of one US Special Forces member. And in that particular scenario, ISIS were using a school to hide the hostages. So again, they were using a civilian location that, nobody wants to bomb a school. I don't think anybody in their right mind would bomb a school, and that's exactly why, again, terrorist groups use this. So people need to be aware of these things. Hostage rescues can work out, but they're very rare. And obviously with that particular operation in northern Iraq, it had Kurdish forces who were local to that area who knew things. You also have the very famous Israeli raid on Entebbe, which was when Israeli forces rescued hostages from a hijacked plane that was flown to Uganda, and there's 2 movies about that if you haven't heard of that before.
Netanyahu's brother was killed in that raid.
He was, was. He was one of the leaders of the...
I don't know if he was the leader of Sayeret Matkal, which is like Israel's Delta Force, or SAS. I'm not sure if he was I think it's Yoni Netanyahu was his name. I'm not sure if he was a leader of the unit, but he was a high-ranking officer in the unit, and he was killed in that raid,
Yeah. So again, bearing that in mind for Benjamin Netanyahu, there's a personal connection right there.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with such a small country like Israel, because everybody does military service and stuff, the entire country feels things in a way that maybe in America and Britain we wouldn't. We definitely don't have such a close, at least in the UK, we don't have quite such a close, tight connection to the military in the way Israel does. But in saying that, I have had a lot of friends who went into the army and stuff, and one in particular did get blown up, but he luckily survived it. And he's actually gone on to do very positive things from that terrible experience. But that's going off on a tangent there slightly. So with the hostages, again, logistically speaking, there's a lot of issues. Locating the hostages, dealing with the armed Hamas fighters who are going to be holding the hostages, then getting the hostages out of the tunnel and to the surface, and then the extraction of 100 plus hostages. In fact, I heard in the BBC today, it's 220 hostages that are held at the moment.
It's 220 hostages, we believe. They released 4 of them, all women. I think at least two were dual U.S. citizens. I'm not sure about the other 2. 138 of them hold foreign passports. Up to 30 are children.
Wow. So there we go. How do you get 220 people out of somewhere? It's not easy. And the thing is, I was looking at the helicopters Israel have, and they've only got Black Hawks, which hold 14 people, or the larger CH-53 that only holds 24 people. Yeah. And the thing about the CH-53 is a huge helicopter. Where the hell are you going to land that thing? Or multiple versions. You could use a Chinook, which holds 55 people, or the more maneuverable Osprey, but again, that only holds 24 people. And then with those helicopters, helicopters in this scenario, you would need protective cover for them. So that would mean Apache gunships, fighter jets. And I just, I mean, this is a helicopter rescue. If they could get them out by boat, there's another option. If you can get them out by motor vehicle, which again is a bit risky, I think they would pick an aircraft because it's quick, get them out. But there's so many logistics involved in a hostage rescue that 220 people who also could definitely be spread across different locations. They're not all being held in like one hall somewhere. They're going to be spread out, and half of them could just be immediately executed when the other half have been rescued. There's all sorts of horrible things and scenarios that could come into place. So the only thing I do see is some sort of negotiation needing to take place, which is what that Gerson Baskin article talked a little bit about. But then with this negotiation, so with the Gilad Shalit case, he was one soldier. They had to release 1,000 Hamas prisoners for one soldier. So for 220, what are they gonna ask for? And is that a cost Israel can afford to pay, especially after it's been revealed that one of the 1,000 Hamas prisoners led this raid in Israel that started all this?
Yeah.
So there's so many factors here that I just, honestly, I feel so sorry for those people who are in captivity right now as we speak. I've been literally, over the last couple of weeks, when I'm wandering around, if I see a kid, immediately my mind either thinks of a child who's been beheaded, one of the children as a hostage, or then, a child killed in one of the Israeli airstrikes against the Palestinians in Gaza. And it's just, every time I see a kid, it makes my mind go to one of those three scenarios. And all of them are horrible. You just do not ever want to get caught by a terrorist group, people. I was thinking of that Leonardo DiCaprio film, is it Body of Lies, where I think early on in the film they're saying, rules of the day, we do not get caught alive, And I kind of feel like with a terrorist situation, you don't really want to get caught alive. You either want to kill them or get killed. You don't want to end up being held hostage for many years. And then find you get murdered at the end of the dreadful experience, Gilad
Shalit was held for 5 years.
Crazy. So this could go on for years, couldn't it? This could go on for a decade or more. I mean, the Terry Waite thing went on for a good, I think, 7 or 10 years, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that went off. So I remember that as a kid in the 80s. I just knew the name. I didn't really understand the situation, but Terry Waite's name would come up on the BBC News quite often. And I just knew he was this man being held in captivity somewhere far away. And then I think he was released somewhere in the early 90s. I vaguely remember all this. And that went on for a very long time. And there were even other hostages who took years to negotiate for as well. And some never came back. So, yeah.
I mean, I've thought for a while, frankly, that unless you negotiate a release of a hostage or multiple hostages, I don't think you're going to get these people out by force. Looking at this situation and so I looked at a couple other big hostage crises to sort of compare the scale of it and the complexity, right? So we already mentioned the Entebbe raid in Uganda. Yeah. That was in 1976. That was 106 hostages, right?
Yeah.
The Beslan school siege, which was in Dagestan or Ingushetia. It was in the Caucasus region of Russia. That was in 2004. That was 1,100 hostages, over 700 children. 314 of them were killed in the operation to rescue them. There's a Moscow theater crisis. That was in 2002. It was 900. 130 were killed. Mind you, the last two that I mentioned were in Russia, and the Russian sort of domestic internal security forces are kind of notorious in their tactics for just gassing whole buildings indiscriminately of who's in.
Well, that was the theater.
That was a theater thing.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a bit of a unique circumstance, but I think something to keep in mind of maybe Entebbe is a little bit different, but I mean, also these crises weren't unfolding in the middle of an active war zone. While an invasion and hundreds of airstrikes are sort of barreling down on the most densely populated strip of real estate in the world, that's like a quarter to a third the size of Los Angeles. I mean, in Moscow, the Russians It was in the middle of Moscow. Russians controlled the airspace, they controlled the ground, they controlled everything going on outside that theater. That's not true with the IDF going into Gaza. I mean, their capabilities are substantial, but I mean, you just don't have the degree of control over the area of operations that you would in sort of any other kind of classic terrorist-driven hostage situation. I don't know. I can't think of another crisis like this that is more complex. I think it's a near impossible task to get them out by force. I think the only way is going to be if any more of them get out, and there's apparently there's something going on between the Egyptians and the Red Cross and the Qataris that Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, sort of and Biden sort of seems to believe that there is a purpose in waiting and trying to hold the Israelis off from launching the invasions, that they believe that there's some way that they can get more out. How many that is, I don't know. They're being very mum about it, understandably, as they probably should be.
Well, yeah. 4 versus 220 is a very small number of people to be released. Very small. It's almost I'm trying to think of the word I want now, but it's such a modest amount of people that
minuscule.
It feels like the bare minimum.
Yeah,
bare minimum that they could do, but to look good. Because it's the thing that pissed me off a little bit. So I watched that press conference with the 85-year-old lady whose name totally escapes me, who was grabbed, put on a motorbike, head down, her body was spread outwardly across this seat, I guess, and she was driven through this field at high speed, beaten whilst they were driving to wherever she was taken to, and then eventually she was given some medical treatment, and all the people who are kind of the online apologists for Hamas at the moment harp on, oh, she got medical treatment, she was treated so well. And then obviously later on, the lady, when she was released, very bravely and I suppose symbolically for shared humanity, shook the hand of her captors before she left. But cynically speaking, Hamas still have her husband in captivity.
Yeah.
So she's only going to say and do so much. I mean, we may not even know the full scale of what her experience actually was, because she might be fearful for repercussions against her husband. But so many people are just jumping on the bandwagon to try and find an excuse to make them feel better because, oh, she was given medical treatment. But yeah, she was still kidnapped. She was still taken on a bike, an 85-year-old woman who was then beaten whilst being driven to wherever it was she was held in captivity against her will for about a week now, in conditions that must have been dreadful. I mean, she looked a lot older in that moment in the press conference than a photograph of her from a few months before with her husband, looking very happy.
Well, I think keep in mind, like if your mother, if your parent was kidnapped by Hamas and they, if they released them, would you go, oh, well, yeah, nice. They took care of her. They gave her medicine. No, I don't think you would be apologizing for them.
No. You would hope they would look after them, because it's the only way I think you could survive the day. Because to think of a relative who's been held in captivity and treated badly, I couldn't think of anything worse.
Well, you have no idea if they're alive or dead. If they died 5 minutes ago, if they're going to die 5 minutes from now, you have no way of knowing, and you may never know. So there's something else about this that I think is especially psychologically distressing for the Israelis. I'm not sure if I've talked about this on here. Have I talked about Pidyon Shvuyim?
Don't think you have. No.
I probably butchered the Hebrew pronunciation of that, but it literally means redemption of captives. And what it is, it's a commandment under Jewish law that makes it a religious duty to effect the release of a fellow Jew held unjustly. And the Talmud says that captivity is a worse fate than starvation or death. So you consider that sort of psychologically what that means for the Israeli consciousness as a whole. And I think you sort of see why they release, 1,000 prisoners to get Gilad Shalit back.
Yeah, and equally under Islamic law, you're supposed to treat prisoners better than your own relatives when they're in your captivity.
Right.
You're supposed to feed them, look after them, give them a good accommodation, be respectful. I don't believe that is happening. One other thing that came up in that article as well. I think it was one of the Israelis who was interviewed mentioned that he didn't hold much hope for the captives, and some of his fellow soldiers sort of see the Israeli captives as martyrs now, which again does not bode well for those poor people.
That's I think a lot of I don't know if Netanyahu himself has said it specifically, but people in his coalition on the sort of Israeli far right have basically kind of broached that idea, which I think is kind of rather dark and cynical. There's been
is that their get out of jail card so they can behave badly? Is that what is that what that is?
Maybe.
Yeah.
But I mean, so there's been a lot of tension, I think, internally in Israel, with a lot of the families of these hostages have been quite outspoken in their criticism of Netanyahu, who, I mean, right up there next to Hamas, I think, frankly, is holds the second responsibility for this.
Yeah. Netanyahu's government's been appalling, and I just want to reiterate that many Israelis, quite a large proportion of Israelis, disagree with Netanyahu.
4 out of 5.
Yeah, and
it's like 80%.
And again, online in the commentary, kind of people treat Israel as this sort of weird homogenous bloc that agrees with everything Netanyahu or any extremist in the Israeli government believes, and the Israeli military. And it's not that simple. Quite those protests that only just recently stopped against Netanyahu, quite a few of those people in those protests end up being victims of Hamas. So, and the majority of Israelis want to get rid of Netanyahu and have been very unhappy with his rule. And and the problem about wars, they either solidify a president's power or they destroy it. And I could sort of see it going both ways for Netanyahu at the moment. I mean, it's a bit like with George Bush. It kind of solidified his power when 9/11 happened and stuff, because at the beginning he was sort of seen as already a bit of a feckless president at the early days of his presidency, and then 9/11 happened and he became a war president. And then this sort of, you can't question active US policy because there are American lives at stake kind of thing set in for many years. And I think that got him through to his second term. And so there's a similar thing that could happen Netanyahu in time, where, you know, things keep happening and you don't want to disrupt leadership during a time of severe crisis. And he might just carry on. I don't know.
That's an important point there. And I distinctly remember hearing, I mean, I was what, 14 during this election. So, I mean, I wasn't, fully cooked yet, but I remember it. People saying during the 2004 election, you don't change horses mid-race, which is basically like, we're in Iraq, we're fighting a global war on terror. We can't change presidents now because, we're sort of already in the middle of it, right? That was sort of an argument that the Bush campaign and his supporters kind of used. I mean, I think that's sort of certainly possible here, maybe. I mean, especially with Netanyahu's current coalition, which has been kind of very anti-democratic and authoritarian, curious at best. That said, I mean, I don't know how he comes back from this. I mean, once sort of like the invasion is done, and maybe even before then. I mean, he was kind of toast even before this, with all the sort of domestic judicial reforms and stuff that they had going on.
Yeah.
I don't know how he survives this.
He shouldn't survive, but he could, and that's the longer he stays in office, the more likely he'll survive.
Yeah.
I think, but we will see. But yeah, I don't know. I still think of those poor hostages are out there right now. It's just, I could not think of anything worse. I wish I had the words to make it sort of somehow feel better, but yeah.
So, yeah, I remember watching this segment on CNN. I think it was last week. I'm pretty sure it was Jake Tapper. But he was in Tel Aviv, and he was interviewing the family members of a little boy. He's like small. Who was kidnapped by Hamas, being held hostage in Gaza right now. and they were saying how this kid wears glasses, and without his glasses, he's like basically like blind, like can't function without his glasses. And when he was kidnapped by Hamas, he didn't get to take his glasses. So they're saying, this kid down in this tunnel somewhere, like alone, without his glasses, can't see.
Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's horrible. It's dreadful. And do you know what? To add to that dreadfulness, one of those kids who's 12 years old, it's his birthday today.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I saw that. They mentioned that on CNN too. Yeah, I mean it's this sort of, what's really kind of shocked me about this conflict is just the stunning scale of inhumanity of it, and by that I mean what Hamas did.
Yep.
And this sort of casual anti-Semitism that has sort of exploded all over the place.
Yeah.
Which is really disturbing, and also the sort of essentially indiscriminate bombing of some parts of Gaza.
Yeah.
And the Palestinians who are suffering there without food and water and electricity and medicine. I mean, that's what's really, and then you hear individual stories like that kid without his glasses, the kid whose birthday is today, and it really kind of puts it all, you kind of zoom in on an individual life lost in this whole thing.
Well, this is it. It's very easy and dangerous for these wars to become mathematics, and I remember the dreadful term collateral damage was invented some point during the Iraq War. At least I believe it was invented then. I certainly don't remember it being in the popular lexicon until that. And civilian casualties need to be avoided as much as one can, and and I'm not quite sure what the cards are for Israel to respond in different ways. But yeah, it's just horrible. And I think in your article they mentioned, I didn't even realize this, that the turning off the water and electricity is kind of a part of a negotiating tactic, apparently. So
that's a double-sided sword.
Definitely.
Yeah. Like I get that sort of tactical advantage that you're trying to assert over Hamas, but there's 2 million other people in there.
Well, the problem is with this bombing the bejesus out of somewhere, how many new sort of terrorists does that create for tomorrow? How many more people are going to be inspired by this? It's, especially that hospital bombing, the reaction to it last week before the information came out. My goodness, as I think you were saying, it did feel like, I don't know, it just felt like this is it. The Middle East is now on fire and God knows what's going to happen.
So for listeners, Chris and I were talking about that before we started recording. That I was texting with Philip Smythe, who I had on the other week, that night that the hospital thing happened, and I thought it was very scary. I thought it was all going to go down.
Well, this is it, and this is the problem. Israel very much uses superior force and overreacts to these situations, and Israel has every right to pursue justice for what happened in this terrorist attack on the 7th of October, and they do need to find a way to bring the individuals responsible to justice in some way, or to remove them, or take them off the battlefield, to use the CIA parlance. And we'll probably talk about that in a minute. And because they can't just let it lie. I don't think anybody would be able to do that, and if anybody thinks that that's the option, are insane. You can't just let people get away with bad behavior like that all the time, and I was being very polite about it. So I'm not quite sure totally what the options are, but I just feel like at the same time, Israel always has this PR problem every time they react to the situations that Hamas started in this situation on the 7th of October. And no matter what they do, they're always going to be in the wrong in some way or another. And this is what Tom Parker calls the terrorist trap. So, we were talking about this the other week, where a terrorist will do something and they will keep successively doing worse and worse things to get the authority who they're fighting against to overreact in such a way where they lose their moral authority. And that's the thing. I think one of the horrific realities of this dreadful reaction to Israel and the 7th of October attack is that Israel's lost a lot of a moral authority over the years for various reasons. Some of that to do with terrorist propaganda, some of that to do with their kind of, should we call it overreactions to certain things and bombing the bejesus out of Gaza or West Bank. I don't know what better options there were, but I certainly don't think bombing the heck out of places and having mass civilian casualties is going to inspire change in a positive way. So something, I don't know, I wish I knew what the answer was, because I'd have the Nobel Peace Prize and go out and deal with it, but I don't, you know. Yeah.
Let's put a pin in that topic. So I didn't pick, somewhat purposely, I didn't pick any hospital stuff so for I don't know, it was just crowded. There's a lot going on. But there's one article in Vanity Fair that just recently came out that maybe we could talk about on the next one, that looks at sort of the internal deliberations and debate and discontent inside the New York Times' newsroom on the night of that hospital bombing. And how they sort of fumbled the ball there.
Go ahead with that.
So, and I think there's something to be said in that reaction of why the press would sort of reach to that conclusion so easily. And I do think the Israelis kind of have a role to play in why people would sort of be like, yeah, the Israelis bombed a hospital, you know? So let's save that for next time, and we can go into that, because there's a lot of interesting stuff too.
There's some very interesting stuff. Yeah.
All right, so should we do Hamas intelligence?
Yeah, let's do it. Spies of Hamas. Yeah.
So technology was thought to have largely eclipsed human-based intelligence collection methods in warfare, but Hamas demonstrated the effectiveness in old-fashioned espionage. Jeff Stein, on his Spy Talk newsletter, has some interesting details on how Hamas employed conventional, let's say analog, intelligence gathering, surprising many Israeli security and defense officials with their sophistication. So Hamas fighters killed in the October 7th attack had detailed maps and tactical guides for Israeli military bases, police stations, and even safe rooms in kibbutzim, indicating a sophisticated level of intelligence gathering. In the past, Hamas has established electronic warfare units and a server farm to disrupt Israeli air defense systems, highlighting their technological capabilities. Some of the 17,000 Palestinians with work permits in Israel, which are, I think, all married men over the age of 35. I think they have to be. Some of those 17,000 Palestinians with work permits in Israel might have been coerced or willingly served as spies, providing Hamas with vital information about Israeli targets. Intelligence shared with the U.S. reveals that a small group of Hamas operatives communicated through hardwired phone lines in tunnels beneath Gaza for over 2 years, allowing them to evade Israeli signals intelligence collection. During this planning period, the group avoided digital communications and stayed off computers and cell phones in favor of old-fashioned counterintelligence measures such as in-person planning meetings and strict compartmentalization. Chris, I think you flagged this article for us.
Yeah, I think Jeff Stein and Spy Talk is very good. And they actually have a podcast as well. And I subscribe to their Substack and get all sorts of interesting little things that come out. So this one did stand out a little bit. And there was a few kind of points within it that crept up. I mean, there's one quote in the article about the level of specificity would cause anyone in the intelligence field's jaw to drop in relation to the Hamas attack. And Jeff pointed out that it sounded like the commander had made the classic mistake of underestimating their enemy. And I think that might well be one of the reasons why, you know, we talked about this last week about the lack of imagination sometimes in intelligence, and I think maybe underestimating what Hamas and the Palestinians could potentially do was a key factor in what happened. And I don't know why, but I find this a little bit disturbing, but not unsurprising that Hamas have had human sources on the ground help in this particular attack. I don't know why I find that a little bit creepier and a little bit worse than 9/11 attacks, because the 9/11 attacks, as terrible as they were kind of targeted at very well-known buildings, whilst with this particular attack, it was sort of targeting small communities and small centres and things like that.
Yeah.
And just to think that there were people who, I don't know, was the gardener last week in the kibbutz, actually working for Hamas and led to, the murders that took place there. I find that quite creepy. And then there's funny enough, not in the article, but in the comments of the article, Jeff made an interesting observation that the Palestinians obviously been spying on Israel in different forms since 1948. And singularly focused intelligence missions tend to have a greater deal of success. And I remember having a chat with Dr. Vince Houghton in like the first year of this podcast about Cuban intelligence a little bit. And he was saying that Cuban intelligence is so effective because basically Cuban intelligence is pretty much 99% focused on America. And so when you have an intelligence service that's just about one particular thing, they're very good at it. And so, yeah, the Palestinians, and Hamas and Hezbollah should never, ever be underestimated. And then, and in the article it talks about, and you mentioned it about their, that they've modernized and they've got this electronic warfare unit that's been trying to neutralize the Iron Dome defenses and disrupt IDF communications. They've probably got electronic surveillance capabilities as well. I'm sure they're monitoring people's social media. So yeah, they're a very sophisticated operation, I think.
I remember seeing reports in the last few weeks of survivors in some of those villages saying that they recognized a few of the Hamas gunmen that they had worked in those kibbutzes.
Wow.
Yeah. That's something to your point before, that this attack is just way more personal than 9/11 was. I mean, 9/11 was on such a sort of grand kind of scale, but this was, going into people's homes, getting up close and personal, which is, I think, what really was just so shocking about this. But yeah, I mean, I think frankly, there's sort of a tendency of a lot of sort of people in the West to sort of say that, to look at these groups like Hamas or Hezbollah or some of the other Iranian backed groups and say like, oh yeah, Hamas is ISIS, which basically means, they're savages, they're monsters, they're basically like just cardboard kind of cartoon villains. And frankly, I think I get their point, but I mean, speaking as someone who's sort of studied these groups for 15 years now, if that, close to 20 probably, I think we underestimate these groups at our peril. It's sort of like trying to, go into a cage with a tiger without respecting it first. These are well-trained, well-funded, well-armed actors working at near nation-state levels of sophistication. I think when you talk about Hamas to an extent, but especially Hezbollah, I think they have more in common with a rogue state such as, North Korea or Gaddafi's Libya than they do, what you would think a straight-up terrorist group like Al-Qaeda. And if you try to reduce them to just bloodthirsty kind of savages, you're not going to fully understand what they are and why they endure and what makes them so powerful. It's so much more than that. And I just think that's important to sort of keep in mind. And I think that Hamas was able to gather this much extensive specific intelligence on a really, like mapping out where safe houses are in particular buildings in these little villages. I mean, that's extensive, really professional stuff. Another thing, I would love to know more about that electronic warfare unit. I mean, Jeff Stein's article didn't really say like they were trying to sort of neutralize the Iron Dome, but I want to know how.
Well, yeah, that would be my one criticism of the article a little bit. It's quite light on details. It was very much an overview.
I mean, he may not have those details.
No, he probably doesn't. And he talked a little bit about his experiences of running Spies in Vietnam, which was really great.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the underestimating of Middle Eastern actors is quite common. I remember, fun enough, in the conspiracy theory world, Alex Jones used to say, you can't believe a man in a cave planned 9/11. Now, why can't you believe a man in a cave planned 9/11?
Why not?
Why not?
Also, Bin Laden wasn't in a cave.
No, exactly.
He was not found in a cave.
No. But from Alex Jones's point of view, I think he thinks Bin Laden's some primitive guy who, doesn't even have a satellite phone or anything. Yeah. And it's like, these groups have been nothing but sophisticated. I mean, gosh, even if you go back to some of the early Tom Clancy novels where he looks at Middle Eastern terrorism and stuff, he knew about what was going on. He knew the sophistication of all these groups.
Yeah. I mean, in the Sum of All Fears, he has a couple. I think they were Lebanese terrorists. They weren't quite Hezbollah. They were Lebanese. Yeah, they sort of reverse engineer a hydrogen bomb.
Yeah.
From one that they dug out of the Golan Desert.
And and the senior leadership of like all these terrorist groups tend to be all PhD holding people and stuff like that. Bin Laden, I think, was an engineer, wasn't he? His deputy was a doctor, and they consulted architects to figure out where the best part of the Twin Towers was to strike and things like that. They considered all those things. So, just because somebody's from the Middle East, you should never think that they are stupid or lesser than you. It's a really bad mentality. And I think maybe, I don't know whether that's the case in Israel and Israel's senior leadership, but one could say if there is this sort of far-right government that's been in power in Israel for a while, you could believe that then there are some far-right sort of Israelis in the senior positions, the military, who may well think in terms like that, but obviously I can't verify that. But just speculating very widely there. It's like when Trump was in power, he positioned certain people into positions of authority who, quite frankly, were not up for the job, and I'm sure Netanyahu may well have done the same thing.
Yeah, a couple more interesting points that I had here. So the Hamas's sort of internal phone and data network inside Gaza, that was new to me. I mean, I knew.
Oh, yes.
I'm not surprised by it.
Yeah.
Hezbollah is known to have a huge internal telecommunications network that's sort of spread all throughout Lebanon. It's actually featured a bit in Active Measures. But it makes sense to me then that Hamas would also have one. I mean, they're both sort of backed and sponsored by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and so why wouldn't they just build one for Hamas? Too, in the same area.
I can't remember if it was this article, something I've read recently, that Hamas and Hezbollah are using Chinese GPS units, Chinese equivalent to GPS, which the Israelis and the Americans allegedly can't penetrate. And, I don't know if that's true or not, but, somebody somewhere was saying that.
They may not want us. We might want them to think that we can't penetrate that. But I feel like this sort of Chinese satellite positioning system would be a quite high on the target list for the NSA.
I'm sure it is.
But, let them think that. Another thing here. So, many people have sort of called Gaza an open-air prison, and I think that's warranted, frankly, but I think the situation on the ground before this attack was a bit more complicated. This article says like 17,000 Palestinians had work visas to hold construction and agricultural jobs inside Israel. Hundreds of trucks came into Gaza from Israel every day. And like, if you go on like Google Maps, right, and you look at like most of southern Gaza, you'll see huge expanses of greenhouses. And Gaza, for a long time, their sort of biggest export, their cash crop essentially was flowers that they would grow, and the Israelis would let it come through the crossing, and they would be exported to like the Netherlands, where they have those big, huge commercial flower markets. And I think that those programs, that sort of leniency that the Israelis kind of allowed in recent years, was certainly predicated on the belief that Hamas had kind of matured, that they weren't essentially, ISIS. And it was sort of was predicated on the belief that such a massacre that we saw was not possible. And all of that, no matter how this war ends, whether or not Gaza is ultimately turned to glass or not, I don't know. But regardless of how the war ends, all that stuff is gone. Well, those 17,000 Palestinians with work visas, those exports, that Gaza had, all of that's over because of this attack.
Well, this is one of the things maybe people forget about terrorist groups, especially Islamist-inspired terrorist groups. They want to remove any grey area or any kind of mutual relations between Arabs and Israelis, or with the case of Al-Qaeda, Muslims and non-Muslims. The reason they do that, they aren't trying to make this bright fuzzy world for Muslims. They're trying to just get more recruits for their version of Islam. And so anybody who is being pally with the Israelis, they will see as a collaborator in some way or another, and not for their cause. And so the more that they can inspire mistrust between Israelis and Arab Israelis, as they're known as, I believe there's some contention over that label, but that's another topic. But as long as there's mistrust between Israelis and Arab Israelis, that makes it very difficult for positive relations to bear fruit. And the last thing Hamas want is positive relations to bear fruit, because then there's no need for Hamas anymore. Same with right-wing Israelis, I guess. There's no need for their sort of very narrow view of Judaism and their ruling of Israel in quite that way, and that's the thing. And so this is the problem about extremist groups. They want to remove the normalization of relations between ordinary people, and they just want to get everybody's back up. And so then they get more recruits for their cause. So this is the sad reality of this situation, is now there is going to be mistrust, isn't there? Massively.
Well, yeah. And it's also, I mean, to your point about, Hamas sort of maybe not wanting Palestinians to sort of have those kind of mutual aid programs and stuff into Israel. It's very hard to dehumanize people that
Yes.
It takes a special kind of person to look someone in the eye and hate them. That's very hard for most people. It's not really in our nature. It's easy to hate an abstraction of a person that you've created or been fed in your mind. It's very hard to hate someone that personally.
But the sad reality is, with at least some of the gunmen, they have crossed over, haven't they, into that territory where they do hate people so much, where they will do unspeakable things to them. One other quick question. We talk a lot about Gaza, as you were saying, about being a prison, open prison, and etc. And people often talk about how it's very difficult to get aid in and stuff. But I'm amazed that Hamas managed to get so much weaponry into Gaza, so much technology into Gaza to aid in this attack. And I've seen videos of them turning water pipes into rocket launchers. And the thing is, the weapons they had on the day of the attack were proper rocket launchers. They were AK-47s, probably some M4 RPGs. Rifles. There was some pretty
small arms,
legit guns there. It weren't like homemade weapons. Because I've seen over the years in Gaza, there's a popular type of gun known as the Carl Gustav, but it's a copy of the Carl Gustav, because the Carl Gustav submachine guns are quite easy to remanufacture if you have the blueprints, apparently. If you know anything about metals and stuff, you can make a functioning machine gun quite easily. But the thing is, they weren't using improvised weapons. They were using legit guns. They got them in there, into Gaza somehow. And again, like as you were saying earlier, Israel had been sort of relaxing certain things over the last few years, maybe because of Hamas, I'll put in quotation marks, revised charter, because we were talking about the Hamas charter in the last episode. So if you've not heard about the Hamas charter, please listen to the last episode. But Hamas have always had it in their charter to destroy Israel and to send Jews to the into the sea, and so maybe again the Israelis, thinking of the better nature of Hamas, started to think that they matured, as you said earlier, and it's very sad that actually they haven't.
Yeah. Well, to sort of answer your question about how they get the weapons in, that's the Iranians essentially. They have extensive smuggling networks that come up through Sudan into Egypt. And then into the Sinai Peninsula.
Do you think, are they doing it through tunnels? Because they can't believe they're getting it in lorries and stuff, are they? They won't be getting it via boats.
Partially, not boats. I mean, the naval cordon is pretty pretty tight around Gaza through the border crossings. Yes, to an extent, but also the tunnel networks. So a lot of, like there's small arms and stuff that's easy to smuggle in. They're Hamas's rocket force. I think they're supposed to have up to like 20 to 30,000 various sorts of missiles. Some of them are sort of domestically produced themselves, like you said, through like water pipes and stuff. And some of them are like Fajr rockets that are like Iranian made. and they're, disassembled and then smuggled in pieces and then reassembled in Gaza in sometimes not ideal conditions by people who aren't entirely qualified to reassemble a complex missile system and then fire it off and have it function properly, which is why you saw what happened at the hospital.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
And just remember many years ago, I was having a debate with a very left-wing friend of mine, and he described the Hamas rockets as just mere fireworks. And they're not mere fireworks. These are proper rockets that kill people. And yeah.
Yeah, it's not all little fireworks. I mean, they have some stuff that's quite serious. I mean, the Iron Dome has sort of reduced that to being like a nuisance. I think it would be a lot different if they didn't have if Israel didn't have the Iron Dome. To give some context about those rocket forces and sort of the scale of what the Israelis would be facing if the conflict sort of expands. Hope it doesn't. So Hamas is sort of estimated to have somewhere between 20 to 30,000 rockets and missiles of varying sizes and capabilities. Hezbollah has 160,000.
Yeah.
So should tell you about, the difference in scale. And when I said, that Hezbollah has more in common with North Korea or like Libya's Gaddafi than they do Al-Qaeda, that's why I say that.
Yeah.
They are not to be trifled with.
No. And so for the sake of Israeli citizens, if we do care about the citizens of Israel, they need the Iron Dome. We should not be pissing around with that, but there we go.
Well, let's sort of talk about Mossad and Shin Bet falling back on what they do best after this attack, which is exact revenge on their enemies. So the Times of Israel is reporting that Israel has established a special operations center to track down and eliminate members of the Hamas commando unit known as Nukba, responsible for the attack in southern Israel. The unit will be named after the World War I era Jewish underground organization Nili, an acronym for a Hebrew phrase which translates as "the Eternal One of Israel will not lie." The IDF has already targeted and killed several Nukba commanders in airstrikes. Israel is currently focusing on two top targets: Hamas military commander Mohammed Diaf and political leader Yahya Sinwar, with Israel warning that every Hamas member faces death. Diaf and Sinwar have taken refuge in a network of tunnels in Gaza to evade Israeli airstrikes, and they are now considered Israel's top priorities. Yahya Sinwar, a founding member of Hamas, was elected as a leader of the organization in Gaza in 2017 and is a prominent figure in the group's history. Mohammed Diaf, the head of Hamas's military wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, has remained elusive and is known for his involvement in various attacks and his survival through multiple assassination attempts. Experts believe that while eliminating Sinwar and Diaf would weaken Hamas, it may not completely crush the organization, which remains Israel's declared aim. Chris, what do you think about this?
Well, yeah, it's not surprising, is it, that they're going to be doing this? So obviously, I thought of Operation Wrath of God, which we talked about last time as well, which was the Israeli...
Have that in my notes too.
Yeah, that's the Israeli response to the Munich Olympics 1972. And typically Mossad would have operatives armed with 22 caliber silenced Berettas or a carefully placed bomb. And they would target people who were either directly connected to the Munich Olympic attack or people who were kind of at the planning side of it, and they were fairly successful in getting quite a few people, but they did also kill a lot of innocent people too through mistakes in identity, and it also led to a lot of restrictions on Mossad officers operating in Europe. And I think only maybe in the last of 20 years has potentially some of that legacy got a bit better, because obviously we saw about close relations between Italy and Mossad officers not long ago. And so I think when you start sending out the assassins, it's a slippery slope. But in my personal opinion, there are some cases, I believe, that a carefully planned assassination could save lives. But navigating the morality of such an act is very complicated. 9 times out of 10, it's more likely to bite you in the arse in some way. And, you know, and in many respects, short of arresting the perpetrators behind the 7th of October attack, this is probably, sadly, the next best option. And depending on how surgical the Israeli forces can get, it may be the best way to avoid civilian casualties. I know the CIA have kind of, over the last sort of maybe 5 or 10 years, got drone strikes down to a fine art now, because they've got this new modified Hellfire which doesn't have an explosive in it, called the R9X, and it has these massive blades that come out, and so when it gets near the target, the blades come out and it literally just chops the person in half, and the force of the missile.
What happened to Zawahiri?
Exactly. Yeah.
Bin Laden's deputy on his balcony in Kabul.
Yeah, exactly. And so, as horrific as that is, killing Ayman al-Zawahiri is probably a positive, because he was the head of Al-Qaeda, you know? Yeah. And Al-Qaeda has been in a, it's very, because the drone program is incredibly controversial. So it's not, because obviously the drone program has led to an awful lot of civilian casualties. So don't mistake my earlier comment for me thinking that they are kind of without casualty. Drones are pretty awful, but this modified Hellfire missile has certainly reduced the level of civilian deaths versus a Hellfire missile that is loaded with explosives. And so in the right circumstances where, they can use that might be a choice the Israelis might go for. So it's and then I was also thinking of the Mossad killing of Hamas chief's weapon buyer, is Mahoud al-Mabawi in Dubai. I hope I got his name right there. Do you remember that one? Where the Israeli
the guy in the hotel.
Exactly, yeah. The guy at the hotel
they had bad passports or something.
That's it. You had the Mossad hit squad that had about 26 people involved in this operation to kill one man.
Big op.
Yeah, and they all got, all the key people were caught in the hotel CCTV. Obviously, they're wearing various disguises and things, but they were soon exposed and their faces in the international media everywhere. And if you Google this particular assassination, you can see all the faces of the Israeli people involved. So I doubt they'll be able to travel to Europe freely or anything like that. They basically targeted this Hamas guy in Dubai, and they broke into his hotel room, gave him a muscle relaxant so he was paralyzed, and then they electrocuted him and then suffocated him, which honestly probably not
the way to go.
Yeah, it's not the nicest way to go at all. I think a 22 caliber bullet to the head quickly would be much nicer than being electrocuted and then suffocated. So it's definitely, with assassinations, I think if one's going to do it, I think the only ethical thing, because we're already throwing ethics out the window quite a bit by assassinating people, but I think the only next step is to make sure it's quick and relatively painless. But that's just,
I got a feeling Mossad's going to get creative with some of these people.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to get fucking medieval on them.
Yeah. I can understand them wanting to do that. I don't condone that, by the way, because a lot of people were very brutally murdered in that attack. But there we go.
Just telling you what they're probably going to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One thing though, about talking about us Americans and assassinations. Don't call it an assassination. It's a lethal finding. Very important. This message brought to you by the Central Intelligence Agency Office of General Counsel.
Oh, is that what they call it now?
Yeah.
How funny.
It's a lethal finding. Yeah, I mean, so I think you're a bit more bearish on this strategy than I am. I mean, I think this is truly the environment, the type of operations in which Israeli intelligence thrives. They have an incredibly long memory and they will find you. I'm thinking about Operation Garibaldi in 1960, kidnapping Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust in Buenos Aires, dragging him back to Israel to stand trial. Operation Wrath of God that we talked about, in response to the Munich Olympic massacre in 1972. The assassinations of numerous nuclear scientists over the decades working for Iran, Iraq, Egypt, and Syria. The assassination of Imad Mughniya, Hezbollah's military chief of staff in Damascus in 2008. Compared to a full ground invasion of Gaza, I think this is probably the most appropriate way to handle retribution for the attacks.
Yeah.
I think they should, and they will eventually hunt down and eliminate every single last Hamas gunman who crossed that fence, every leader who ordered and planned the attack, every financier and logistician who facilitated it. I think anyone and everyone who touched this op must die. I think it's kind of the only way for Israeli intelligence to regain their honor after missing this attack.
Unfortunately, it's just a very slippery slope. I mean, ideally, from a human rights perspective, that every mission should have the option to try and arrest people, but that's not really going to happen in the Gaza Strip, is it?
No. I mean, look, I think you'll also start seeing Hamas operatives, leaders who even outside of Gaza start turning up dead. Like their leaders in Qatar.
Yeah.
Once this sort of invasion really kicks off and we sort of don't need the Qataris to kind of negotiate hostages anymore, I would think it's going to be open season on some of those Hamas members in Qatar and the Gulf and elsewhere. Yeah. I think, look, if when it comes to a full-scale ground invasion, I question what military objectives are achievable in doing such a thing. I mean, are you going to kill every military-aged male in Gaza? I mean, what does victory look like?
Yeah.
Should Bibi Netanyahu be able to walk through the ruins of Gaza City and no one tries to take a shot at him? Is that what victory would look like? I just don't know how I mean, should Hamas be destroyed? Yes. But is it feasible to do given the costs that it would take Israel to achieve that? I really question this. And another thing, I think after this attack, in the immediate aftermath of this attack, I think the Israelis had a unique opportunity to turn the Arab world against Hamas the way the Arab world turned against ISIS. And I think that chance has already been squandered by turning half of Gaza to glass.
Echoes of 9/11 again. America had that opportunity.
And Biden went over there and said, don't do what we did.
Yeah.
And I don't know, history's kind of repeating itself. I mean, if you look at so the terrain in Gaza, right? You can't send Merkava tanks and armored personnel carriers into that kind of urban terrain in Gaza. They're going to get bogged down. They're going to lose their infantry support. There's going to be Molotov cocktails and IEDs and people coming around corners with RPGs. They're going to get slaughtered. What you would have to do first is you would have to basically flatten the entire city and then send the tanks in to clean up what's left. That's what you're looking at in this invasion. And that's what you're going to have to do to achieve the objectives that they're saying. And I don't know that those objectives are achievable at the cost they would warrant. When you could do it a lot quieter behind closed doors and take your time and slowly, one by one, get your list together, anyone who touched this op, and just go down the list and start crossing off names.
Yeah. Well, one controversial thought I've had for a little while, I wonder if Hamas has been watching Ukraine's success against Russia.
I'm sure.
Who were seen as a superior force, who've lost a lot of tanks and stuff using very low-key tactics, a drone dropping a grenade on a tank. And I think Hamas has got themselves geared up to fight the Israelis like the Ukrainians are fighting the Russians. I really do.
Yeah.
And I think that might be the trap they're about to walk into if they're not careful.
If you go back to these sort of opening days of the invasion of Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
When the Russians were that huge, 40-mile long or something armored column was at sort of the gates of Kyiv, the Russians couldn't even get past the suburbs, much less into the middle of Kyiv city center, because it was going to be a complete and utter bloodbath.
Yeah.
And that's no different for the Israelis.
No. And I just think warfare's changed a lot in the last 18 months. Maybe I'm wrong there. Not a warfare historian, but certainly it feels like warfare's changed a lot since the Ukraine wars happened. And I don't get the impression that the Israelis have really studied properly what's going on, considering, especially in Ukraine, it's like Iranian drones being used and stuff like that against the Ukrainians. You would have thought that Mossad or someone should go out there and study what's going on, because there are going to be consequences at some point down the line.
Well, you know what's interesting? I think before this attack, and when Putin came out and was sort of like, go Hamas, the Israelis, at least Netanyahu's government, were sort of hedging their bets between the two. You know, they were never really all that openly supportive of the Ukrainians. I mean, I think the Ukrainians asked for a bunch of Israeli weapon systems, and the Israelis were like, no. Because they sort of wanted to keep that kind of close-ish relationship with the Russians, and that totally blew up in their faces.
Yeah.
Zooming out on the map, we're going to leave the Middle East behind for now and return to another ongoing bloody conflict that hasn't slowed down a wink, even though much of the West has been distracted the last few weeks. Better late than never, the White House has signed off on providing ATACMS to Ukraine, which sat right at the top of President Zelensky's shopping list. A New York Times article by David Sanger breaks down the details. So here we go. Ukrainian forces launched attacks on 2 key Russian air bases using American-made ATACMS long-range missiles. President Biden approved the covert delivery of these missiles, marking a shift in U.S. policy as Biden was previously concerned about escalating the conflict with Russia. The White House reversed its stance on providing the weapons after similar long-range missiles were supplied by Britain and France without significant Russian reaction. ATACMS, which stands for Army Tactical Missile System, that's creative, can be used by Ukraine to strike up to 100 miles into Russian-occupied territory, causing damage to runways, helicopters, an ammunition depot, and more. The U.S. delivered about 20 of these missiles in secret to Ukraine and are a version of ATACMS that utilize cluster munitions. Their use in conflicts is banned by an international agreement that the U.S. has not signed, and I believe the U.S. gave these specific the specific type of cluster munition warhead because we've sort of decided that we couldn't see us using that kind of munitions ourselves in any conflict anytime soon, so we give it to the Ukrainians.
And there's a apparent shortage of the other kind that America needs to hold on to.
Yeah, just the regular sort of singular high explosive warheads that we need for probably for the Chinese someday.
Coming to a podcast near you soon.
Yeah. God, not now. Can we got to settle some other stuff before we do that.
Yeah.
I can't do it all. All right. Germany may be pressed to donate its Taurus missile systems now. Ukraine has pledged not to fire the American ATACMS into Russian territory, a pledge it has also made for the use of British and French systems. The strikes on the air bases were reported by Russian military bloggers who described them as a major setback for the Russian military. Up to 1,300 Russian troops may have been killed in the strikes, marking one of Russia's deadliest days of the war. Chris, what do you got?
Well, what have I got about this? So, number one, it took me a while to work out how to pronounce this, ATACMS. Until I read the article, because I was like, oh, that's how you pronounce it. Because I was like looking at this acronym thinking, how on earth do you pronounce this acronym? So ATACMS makes sense. And as you mentioned, it's these cluster munitions, the one they've got. With all the controversy around cluster munitions, we did talk about it a while back. And in particular with these cluster munitions, if they don't work, there are plans for a proper cleanup after the fact. So, and again, that they're targeting military targets. They're not just targeting civilian areas of cluster munitions, which is where, understandably people get concerned because children can pick these things up and blow themselves up. And the cluster munition can be quite effective against its target because obviously it's spreading a lot of explosives over a small area. So, in fact, these might be the perfect weapon for Ukraine. And it just makes the environment more difficult for Russia to operate in. They've already pulled a large bulk of the Black Sea fleet out of the main base in occupied Crimea, not particularly because of these missiles, but just because of the success of drone strikes and other missile strikes against Russian forces. So the harder you make it for Russia to be able to operate in Ukraine, the more likely it is that Russia will either have to stop what they're doing or it will lead to a defeat of Russia. We will see. And I think, in my view, has changed a little bit in the last sort of few months. I actually think that basically, I think Ukraine needs to win the war before the American elections. I really do. Because if they don't, I think they might be fucked. And, quite frankly, I think they might be. If Trump or some Trumpian type Republican gets in, we could be seeing the end of NATO. We could see all sorts of aid pulled away from Ukraine because sadly, a lot of the Republican Party are either very sympathetic to Russia because Russia presents itself as the savior of the white Christian world. That's how Russia presents itself. And there's a few Republicans who buy into that nonsense. And they're very anti-Ukraine. And I think that really we need to give everything Ukraine needs now to win this war before 2024 election. So they've been asking for this weapon for some time, and I think, as I mentioned before on a previous podcast, the problem about all these delays with the weapons we've been giving Ukraine is it gives Russia time to come up with countermeasures to all these weapons. So finally they've got it. And I think I think Ukraine will use it as responsibly as they can. I don't think could be wrong, but I don't honestly believe you'll be seeing attacks against sort of Russia itself with these weapons. But they will be trying to get back their territory, or at least they're also going to try and remove the superior air power that Russia still have over Ukrainian forces, because the problem is at the moment their land forces, because Russia have superior air power, that provides protective cover for Russians' land forces. It makes it very hard for Ukrainian forces to move forward. So the more the Ukrainians can do to remove that air superiority, the more the Ukrainian conventional forces can move forward and actually win this war. So, if they're able to bomb Russian air bases in occupied territory, then this is great news for the Ukrainians.
I mean, I think ultimately it's better late than never.
Yeah.
That said, I think they're right to give them to the Ukrainians, but I do think that Washington's concerns about escalation, if Ukraine uses these missiles to strike deep inside Russia, was warranted.
Yes,
I think it's fair to be cautious when you're going to jab a stick into the eye of a country that's sitting on an arsenal of 6,000 nuclear warheads.
It'd be irresponsible not to be cautious.
It's just prudent to let's think about this and decide if this is something that we really want to do. That said, I do think there ultimately is a troubling pattern of the White House saying no, and then eventually giving it to them anyway, whether that's tanks or F-16s or what have you, HIMARS back in the day. I do think, hopefully, to your point, I think this will. I hope it will ultimately break the sort of stalemate the Ukraine has found themselves in. I do think it probably helps them to credibly threaten Crimea, which I've long thought, I've said that on here before, that I think the war will enter its end game once the Ukrainians can credibly threaten Crimea, because Putin politically he can't afford to lose Crimea.
No, in many ways he can't afford to lose this war, but I think he needs to. And it's an interesting thing. It was in an article not long ago. If the war were to stop tomorrow, it would take Russia about 5 years to rebuild its forces.
It's not a long time.
Yeah, and so if you have a weakened NATO, what's stopping Russia from moving on to other Eastern Bloc countries or former Eastern Bloc countries?
Yeah, the Baltics.
Yeah, so I think Russia do need to be defeated or stopped in some significant way to make sure that they know that they can't keep getting away with this. We're about to probably move on to more Russian activity that they're getting away with.
Yes. So we're going to turn back the clock here a bit and see, what they got away with for a while. So because we all love chewing on a juicy new piece of open source investigative journalism, Michael Weiss, Christo Grozev of Bellingcat, and Roman Dobrokotov have a sprawling article in The Insider piecing together Russia's role in an explosion at a Bulgarian ammunition depot over a decade ago. So in November 2011, Russia's GRU Unit 29155, tasked with sabotage, assassinations, and direct action missions abroad, executed its first known operation in Lovnedal, Bulgaria, targeting an ammunition depot containing old Soviet artillery rounds slated to be shipped to Georgia after the country's brief 2008 war with Russia. An unexploded IED was discovered near the site, suggesting a deliberate act. Unit 29155, operatives were tasked with developing remote detonators for the attack in Bulgaria, leading to the use of 3 homemade devices concealed in everyday objects. Bulgarian investigators initially failed to connect the incident to foul play, but evidence suggested sabotage. The operation marked the unit's debut in a series of high-profile attacks, including the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal and a Bulgarian arms dealer, as well as a coup attempt in Montenegro. Using travel records and phone metadata, the Insider and Bellingcat uncovered how Unit 29155 operatives used fake identities and staggered arrivals to avoid some detection while preparing for the attacks in Czechia. Some of these operatives were later linked to the Skripal poisoning. The unit was responsible for destroying arms and ammunition depots in Bulgaria and Czechia over the next 4 years, resulting in several casualties and diplomatic expulsions. General Andrei Averyanov, then the unit's commander, was recently appointed deputy director of the GRU, overseeing military and hybrid operations in Africa, East Asia, and the Middle East, and has become a trusted figure in Putin's inner circle, inheriting a substantial portion of the late Yevgeny Prigozhin's business empire. Averyanov and his subordinates have been involved in various covert activities, including constructing remote detonators for the Bulgaria bombing. Leaked data and investigative journalism are shedding light on Averyanov's activities and personal life, including extramarital affairs and financial mismanagement. Other unit members involved in attacks were rewarded with high-profile federal jobs in Russia. The unit's actions in Europe and other regions raise concerns for NATO and EU countries regarding Russian sabotage capabilities. Chris, this is kind of right up your alley, this kind of deep dive.
So yeah, Unit 29155 is definitely becoming legendary in its prolific use of assassinations and now sabotage. And Andrei Averyanov is a fascinating character as well. And I guess he's in some ways, the new Prigozhin now, in some respects.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm fascinated by this sort of last few days in Africa between Prigozhin and this guy. There's definitely a film or a play to be made about maybe those two just a few days beforehand, and especially
like a little two-hander chamber piece.
Could well be, yeah, a bit like the Frost Nixon type thing.
Yes,
there's something in that. And
I think you're working on that.
Yeah. And I think the death of Prigozhin has 29155's hands all over it, because if we're to one of the stewardesses who died on the plane, before the plane took off, she was in text exchange with her relatives, and she mentioned that the plane apparently the plane had extra checks, and there were men looking around it potentially to buy the plane and stuff like that. There's something very fishy about all that, and obviously the plane spectacularly falling out the sky the way it did, and so I reckon 29155 are all over that is my suspicion. And then with these particular attacks, it just shows how brazen this unit is and how the Russian government's attitude is to sanction such operations. With these particular explosions and things, these explosives were placed in a truck that went through the Czech Republic and Bulgaria, bypassing Bratislava, Budapest, Belgrade, and Sofia. And it's a 745-mile trip. And those explosives could have gone off in those munitions truck at any point during that truck's trip. And imagine if that had gone off in a European capital somewhere. First, people would think it's terrorism. But as you do a more forensic analysis and, I don't know, somehow find Unit 29155's fingerprints on it in some way, that would create such the loss of life aside, which would have been quite high, it would create such a diplomatic incident that it just appears that the Russian government don't care. They just don't care. These operations are just so brazen.
Well, I think it sort of speaks to the way they sort of got away with this stuff for years. Prodding NATO, a little bit here and there, stepping up, inching up, thinking they can get away with more and more and more. And I think that very much sort of put us into the world that we're in today. That we didn't smack them back years ago when we should have.
Death by 1,000 cuts, but yeah.
Yes. To another sort of vexing issue for the Russians, I want to read a quote here from the article about General Aryanov's corruption here that I think is pretty illustrative.
They are so corrupt.
And extremely Russian. Okay. So here's a quote. There is also evidence that he has used the resources of his service for personal purposes, starting with his fondness for Land Rover SUVs, a new one of which Averyanov buys every 3 years and whose average sticker price, upwards of $50,000, exceeds his annual on-paper salary as a GRU officer.
Quick note, I've been to the Land Rover factory last year. I filmed in it, and I've seen these things being made. But anyway.
And any Russians there shopping?
Not that I saw, no, but they do hang around some of the dealerships I've seen in central London. But yeah.
Kensington. Yeah, you got a good Kensington to find them. So leaked emails also show he has had multiple simultaneous extramarital affairs with women younger than his 34-year-old daughter, Alexandra. That's gross. Yeah. For whom he threw a Hollywood-style wedding in 2017. One of Averyanov's young former mistresses, whom we'll call Tatiana, told The Insider that the GRU commander plied her with expensive items such as iPads, luxury watches, and presents from his overseas trips, while also housing her in an upscale Moscow apartment near the Kremlin. He spent thousands of dollars each month on Tatiana, just one of his many girlfriends. So this guy gets around. Even outfitting her with a coterie of bodyguards and errand boys, all handpicked by Averyanov from the ranks of Unit 29155.
Yeah.
I just want to say, this is why Russia has spent nearly 2 years getting its fucking ass kicked in Ukraine. This sort of corruption, the fat, malaise, the rot has been a cancer on their armed forces. No professional military should act this way. China cracked down on this hard, and for this very reason. Because you go to war, and you're all sort of fat, corrupt kleptocrats, and all the money that was supposed to go to modernize and train and build up your armed forces got dumped into your, 20-year-old girlfriend.
I know,
and her shopping trips and her apartment.
Yeah.
That's why you're getting your fucking ass kicked in Ukraine. That is why. That's the reason.
Yeah. But I think the last thing we want is a Russia that's competent right now.
Yes.
So have another BMW and what's it, Land Rover.
Yeah. Beyond that, I continue to be amazed at how Bellingcat pieces this information together. And I'd love to compare their reporting on this unit with the reporting coming out of the U.S. intelligence community and see how much on par they are with what the IC has.
From a chat I had a few years ago, I mean, from my understanding with somebody I spoke to, MI6 are sometimes do end up in a situation where they have to justify themselves because of reporting a Bellingcat in the public domain. I
believe it.
Yeah, so I think open source intelligence is changing the way professional intelligence works, and sometimes, open source is sort of is managing to do things that the traditional way can't.
Yeah. The CIA has run an open source center for many, many years, way before it got sexy. I mean, it was originally sort of a they would do simultaneous translation of foreign TV broadcasts and newspapers and stuff, old Soviet military journals and everything. They would analyze that, and you can get a lot of stuff out of those. But I'm sure it's gotten way more advanced since then. Their offices are actually they're in Reston, Virginia. They're right next to the metro. I was literally across the street from it the other week, and I was like, oh yeah, I know it's in that building. You can see all the cameras and the guys with guns out front. Yeah. That's why.
Makes me think of 3 Days to Condor, because wasn't that the operation that Robert Redford was working for, something like that, where they were translating Russian novels or something?
Yeah, that's exactly what that is.
Yeah,
that's what they were doing. Yeah, it's gotten a bit more advanced now, I'm sure.
Yeah, a bit bigger.
Yeah. So, lastly, as if we haven't reached for the third rail enough on this podcast recently, let's talk about Donald Trump.
Woohoo!
Rolling Stone's Oswin Subsang and Adam Rawley reported something we've all kind of known and have talked about here before, but it's no less disconcerting to see in print. So, Donald Trump considered withdrawing the United States from NATO during his first term, but was dissuaded by senior administration officials. for a potential second term, Trump is exploring ways to reduce American involvement in NATO to a, quote, standby position. Trump has expressed a preference for not having, quote, NATO lovers in his administration and has criticized the alliance during discussions about the war in Ukraine. He has indicated a willingness to withdraw from NATO unless the alliance meets his demands, including increased defense spending by non-American members and a reevaluation of the principle of collective defense. Trump's ideas align with a policy brief titled Pivoting the U.S. Away from Europe to a Dormant NATO, circulated within his inner circle. In the past, Trump misunderstood NATO's collective spending agreements, viewing them as dues paid to the U.S. rather than a requirement for defense spending. Concerns about a potential U.S. withdrawal from NATO have prompted legislative measures to prevent it, requiring Senate approval for such a move. Trump's continued frustration with NATO allies and concerns about U.S. military aid to Ukraine raised the possibility of him following through on his threats to leave the alliance if he wins the 2024 presidential election. Even if it becomes more difficult for Trump to formally leave NATO, he could still undermine the credibility of U.S. security guarantees to other member states.
If he hasn't already. Do you know what?
Fair point.
You know what, Matt? As I look to my right, there's a massive storm cloud actually brewing right now. It's this big anvil that's going to lead to a thunderstorm, probably
positively Shakespearean.
It is, and it kind of totally is the metaphor for everything about the Trump getting into the next election right now. I think just what the world really needs, especially Europe really needs right now, is somebody dicking around with the NATO alliance. You know, we've got an aggressive Russia, as we've just talked about. We've got GRU killers bombing and killing people across Europe. And obviously you've got Russia's war in Ukraine. And obviously we've got the crisis in the Middle East that's sort of developing. Do we really need another politician who does not understand how institutions work, who's completely egotistical? Do we really, really need that right now in this world? And why the fuck is Donald Trump a viable candidate in American politics right now? Why is that man not in jail, or at least on the road to jail? I'm sorry, but it's just so ridiculous, and it's completely blowing American credibility, because in Europe, where I'm based, you know, in the UK, and all I see is endless debates about, well, what do we do if we can't rely on America anymore? And, you know, America is losing its soft power dramatically. And in time, it's going to lose its hard power too. If it starts to pull out of NATO and start messing around with that, you're going to cause no end of problems. And, you know, and I really think it's a bad thing. And I will just add, just out of balance, there are far left candidates who also believe nonsense like this about disbanding NATO. In the UK, we had Jeremy Corbyn. If he'd been Prime Minister, one of his objectives was to pull Britain out of NATO. And we don't need that either. But what we do need are some sensible politicians who understand how things work and who are true statesmen or stateswomen or statespeople. I'm not quite sure what the appropriate term is for a statesperson. But we need professionals who know what they're doing, who can run a government without causing a crisis every 10 seconds because they don't know what the fuck they're doing.
You who just had Bojo for how long?
I know, but I know. Oh my goodness, yeah. We know a lot about ineffectual politicians in this country at the moment, and the damage they cause. Liz Truss, in particular, damaging the British economy in a dramatic way in less than 41 days. And she's being invited to some massive financial conference as a guest of honor, which is quite ironic. But there we go.
Okay.
You know, obviously Bernie Madoff's no longer available, and Nick Gleason wasn't available for comment.
Yeah.
But
Sam Bankman-Fried is tied up.
Yeah, I just really wish Western politics as a whole would sort itself out, because it's so painful that we keep having ineffectual candidates on all sides coming out of the woodwork and causing all sorts of issues and making us have all these existential crises where we think that the whole world is imploding. And we just need to get our act together, because it's really quite bad. And the world right now, definitely, for good or bad, the world needs a strong America right now. Certainly Europe needs it. And I don't know. If Trump gets back in, I just see nothing but the storm cloud to my right that's getting ever bigger.
Yeah.
So there's my rant. One star comments are welcome.
Well, let me start off with this. I think without going into spoilers for Active Measures Part 2, I'll say I've shed far too much blood, sweat, and tears researching and writing about Article 5, NATO's Collective Defense Clause, much more than I ever wanted to. And so I can say with, I think, some authority that Trump has no idea what the fuck he's talking about when it comes to Article 5 or even the spending agreement. So Article 5 is, it's NATO's Collective Defense Clause. It's in the Washington Treaty, which is NATO's charter. It basically says an attack on one of us is an attack on all. And it was basically sort of made, in the 50s, so that let's say a hypothetical Soviet invasion of Iceland would be treated no differently than a bunch of tank divisions blazing through the Fulda Gap into West Germany. That said, when a NATO member invokes its Article 5 privileges, the North Atlantic Council gets together and they discuss the attack which an alliance member supposedly faced. So we invoked Article 5 after 9/11. I believe that was the first time it was ever invoked by us after 9/11. It's been not quite invoked since then. Turkey invoked Article 4 a couple times, which its right to consultations during the Syrian civil war a few times. And I believe Poland invoked it when Ukraine was invaded, invoked Article 4. But when the North Atlantic Council meets and sort of discusses the attack and sort of determines amongst itself that Article 5 should be operationalized, the language of the clause in NATO's charter says essentially, I don't have it right in front of me here, it says essentially that alliance members will sort of provide aid to the extent that they're sort of able and deem necessary based on their own sort of capabilities and national defense commitments, which doesn't mean that the president of, I don't know, pick a random Eastern European country that's a member of NATO, Macedonia, North Macedonia, right? The president of North Macedonia cannot order up the American 82nd Airborne Division because the president of North Macedonia is not the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, right? So even if Article 5 is operationalized for whatever reason, right, it's still on the president of the United States to decide how the U.S., and this is true of any other NATO member, you guys, France, Germany, whoever, Italy, right, Canada, it's on those individual countries to decide then how it will come to the alliance's aid, right? So it's not like, it's not a suicide pact. Let's describe it that way. And as for the defense spending, your NATO members are supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on its defense budget, right? So for us or you guys or France or Germany, that would be that percentage would just mean a lot more than, say, North Macedonia, right? That has a much smaller GDP. It's not what Trump seems to misunderstand. I don't know if this is on purpose or not. It's not like a country club. NATO isn't like a country club membership. You know, like he seems to think that defense spending is like dues that we're being paid, and he thinks that they're not paying enough. That said, I think a lot of European countries, you guys included, if I'm being frank, have not been spending enough on your defense spending. Your militaries have been gutted, and Europe has depended on the American defense umbrella for far too long. And I would love to see you guys beef up your militaries back to sort of a comparable level to sort of where they were in the early 2000s, perhaps.
Oh yeah, I agree. And we've had successive governments have gutted the Royal Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and it's getting even worse actually. Because I do some work on the Warships podcast, listening to various episodes of that. You know, the Royal Naval Defence Reviews just been a disaster zone for years, and there's just no political will. There's not a proper adult political understanding about the military anymore in this country. You either get people who talk about the industrial arms complex, or you get people who are the other side of that spectrum, where they want to bomb the bejesus out of everything and over militarize, but you don't have people who have proper mature debates about like the need of tridents and stuff like that. It just gets silly every time.
I think also to your point about Western politics being just very kind of silly and juvenile and idiotic, and how we need to get our act together. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think could one have made the argument in the 90s, or maybe even up to a couple years ago, like, what's NATO doing? Does it need to sort of exist in this state? You could have made that argument. I think the minute the Russians went into Ukraine, that sort of argument just went out the window.
Oh, yeah.
Even then, like, to Trump's point that, like, in the article, it sort of says how Trump sort of believes. I mean, Trump doesn't really believe anything. These are his advisors that are telling him this. That NATO's sort of like bloated and ineffective. NATO's command structure, whether it's the international staff in Brussels or allied command operations in Mons, and the sort of whole military apparatus that's under that, that's been pared down drastically since the end of the Cold War. It's quite a lean joint kind of command and control center is essentially what it looks like if you look at like an org chart. It's very silly. But so to your point about Western politics being very silly and we need to get our act together, I agree with you. I think we've sort of talked on here before about this sort of anti-democratic authoritarian axis that's been developed between Russia, China, Iran, portions of the global South that are kind of, sitting on the fence, that are with us some days, that are with them the other days. I think if we got our act together, whether, us, Europe, Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Southeast Asian countries that really want nothing to do with China, we could bury those people together. It wouldn't even be a contest. That sort of authoritarian anti-democratic axis can only defeat us if we first defeat ourselves by acting like jackasses.
And we are. Yeah. Look at Twitter. I mean, it's a disaster zone.
We're going to talk about that soon.
The extra shot. Yeah. Yeah. But it's well, maybe we'll save that for extra shot then. But yeah, it's case in point.
All right. So that's about it for today's Espresso Martini. Links to the articles we discussed today will be in the show notes. Chris and I are going to continue our conversation on Extra Shot. If you're a subscriber, we'll see you there shortly. And if not, we hope you sign up and join us. Before we wrap up today, I just want to take a moment and give a special thanks to our listeners. I think it's safe to say, Chris, that you and I were a little nervous releasing our last few episodes. We're covering issues that people have bitterly fought over for 2,000 years. And while we try our best, we never know how an episode will land until it's out and beyond our control. The reception, though, it seems, has been really great. We've gotten a few very touching reviews lately that, for me anyway, I think validates why we do this show. I mean, we're not CNN, of course. We don't want to be. But I think we try to use this format to wade into these heavy and recently oppressively dark issues and hopefully offer a bit of nuance, depth, and clarity that I think often gets lost in the noise. I think on most days, our world isn't as dark as the more cynical corners of our minds may paint it to be. And I hope that in these conversations we have, you'll see a glimmer of hope as well. So all that to say, thanks for sticking with us. Chris, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that.
Honestly, I don't think I could top that, Matt. No, seriously. Thank you, everybody, for, listening to us. And obviously, and I just speaking for myself, do you find these shows quite therapeutic sometimes? Because I'm, trying to understand these things as much as probably you are listening. And just through the process of every couple of weeks of having to select all these stories, look into them and realize certain things, I find it very, very helpful, and I'm just glad that you're finding it helpful too. So thank you for supporting us and sticking with us, and we're gonna we'll do our best to keep on that course.
Yep, well said. All right,
thank you.
Take care, everyone. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everybody. Speak to you in a bit. Bye.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.